July 16th, 1945, Potsdam. Amidst the ruins of a defeated Germany, the leaders of the three great Allied powers, U.S. President Harry Truman, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin met for their first conference since the end of the Second World War in Europe. On the agenda was the defeat of Japan and, more significantly, the future of Europe. The communist dictator and the leaders of the two greatest democracies were, at best, uneasy allies. In the first morning session, Marshal Stalin proved aggressive and tough. But that very morning, President Truman received a top-secret telephone message from Washington. It was a short but momentous conversation. The U.S. had successfully tested the atom bomb. Truman immediately informed Prime Minister Churchill. Churchill understood that the world would no longer be the same.
The Potsdam Peace Conference is a very interesting phenomenon in terms of atomic diplomacy, as one might call it. President Truman came with what he thought was an ace in the hole. Truman was a straightforward person and basically said to Stalin, we have this new weapon and it's just been test fired, and happy to tell you all about it. And essentially, Stalin showed little interest or no interest. Well, that's nice, and they went right on with the discussion.
The Western leaders decided that the Soviet leader simply didn't understand the news, that he had no idea how the atomic bomb changed the global balance of power.
The same day back in his residence, Stalin told his foreign minister Molotov and Marshal Zhukov, they decided I could not properly appreciate American achievements and were disappointed with my reaction. Later that day, Stalin spoke to Lavrenti Beria, the head of the atomic project. We must not allow the U.S. to have a military advantage over us and put pressure on us. Tell our people to hurry up with the project and ask them if they need anything.
But unknown to Truman and Churchill, Stalin and his head of secret police, Lavrenti Beria, already knew a great deal about America's atom bomb from their extensive spy network in the West. They even knew the exact date and time of the first American nuclear explosion.
The Soviets under Beria, who was the spy chief under Stalin, so I mean it's an absolute top-level operation. They have got a gigantic program to get everything they can on the atomic bomb activities in England and the United States.
The American nuclear project and the Soviet hunt for atomic secrets started almost simultaneously. The race for the bomb had begun even before the start of the war. On August 15, 1939, nuclear physicists Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard sent a letter to President Roosevelt, warning him that Germany was well advanced in the development of a super bomb. They implored the president to act quickly to avoid global disaster. On September 1st, 1939, a war broke out in Europe. In less than a year, continental Europe had fallen to the Nazis. Roosevelt realized the necessity of developing the atomic bomb. Thus was born the Manhattan Project. Leslie Groves, an Army general who'd supervised the construction of the Pentagon, was appointed to head the nuclear project. Robert Oppenheimer was named head of scientific research. At Oppenheimer's request, a new top-secret scientific facility was established in the vicinity of Los Alamos, New Mexico. This sleepy town in the American Southwest became the gathering place for the most brilliant scientific minds. The world's top physicists, chemists, and mathematicians assembled here to crack the nuclear riddle. It wasn't long before Los Alamos also attracted unwanted attention. In 1940, Leonid Kvasnikov, a young, obscure officer from the Technical Scientific Department of the Soviet Secret Police, the NKVD, made his own little discovery.
сделал свое открытие.
Kvasnikov noticed that any research information on radioactive uranium had disappeared from Western scientific journals.
Специалист
He came to the conclusion that it meant the beginning of practical development for a new weapon based on the fission of uranium.
журнала публикации об атоме.
But this was a frightful time for Leonid Kvasnikov and other Soviet intelligence officers. The NKVD was being decimated by Stalin's purges.
Резидента из Нью-Йорка вызвали.
Our resident in New York was summoned back to Moscow and executed.
Начальника отделения.
My boss supervising my division was proclaimed an enemy of the people and sent to the Gulag in the far north.
Народа.
He died there in 1943. The head of intelligence, whom I knew well, was arrested and executed.
Начальника разведки.
I started this job with people getting arrested and executed all around me.
Расстреляли. Военных целях.
In 1940, I sent cables requesting any information on the atomic problem to our stations in New York, Berlin, Paris, and London.
Despite the purges, Soviet intelligence was still brilliantly successful. As early as September 1941, Moscow received a copy of nuclear plans contained in a 70-page report from the British Uranium Committee. A Soviet operative had taken it from the desk of British Prime Minister Churchill.
Получив сообщение.
After Kvasnikov got this information, he sent an urgent memo to his boss, Lavrenti Beria. It was a critical time for the Soviet Union in the midst of the Nazi advance at Moscow. The Germans were 300 kilometers from the Soviet capital.
Lavrenti Beria knew that Stalin was fully preoccupied with the challenge of defending Moscow. To lose Moscow would mean losing the war. Beria didn't tell Stalin about the race for the bomb, but he did order his agents to double-check Kvasnikov's information. By March 1942, the German blitzkrieg had failed. The Soviets launched a bitter counteroffensive at Moscow, decimating the German army. Only then did Lavrenti Beria inform Stalin of the West's research on a super bomb. Beria's file contained very sensitive, classified material. A cable from Switzerland from ace Soviet spy Dora warning of German efforts to develop the bomb. Soviet agent Charles in London sent calculations for an explosion mechanism for the bomb. Agent Homer sent abstracts from a top-secret report of the British Uranium Commission. Among the Commission's conclusions was a staggering fact. The explosive force of a mere 10 kilos of uranium equaled the destructive impact of 1,600 tons of TNT. Beria's file also contained a letter from Russian physicist Georgy Flerov. Before the war, he'd been one of Russia's key nuclear scientists. Flerov wrote to Stalin, "A single nuclear bomb is sufficient for annihilation of either Moscow or Berlin, depending on who has the bomb. The state that makes the nuclear bomb first will dictate its terms to the rest of the world." Stalin was fascinated by the idea of creating a super bomb. He decided to give the codename Uranium to the military operation against the Germans at Stalingrad. Many members of Stalin's general staff searched in vain for the meaning of the word uranium. In March 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad broke the back of the German offensive on the Eastern Front. With the Nazis in retreat, Stalin called for a meeting in the Kremlin. He ordered work on a Soviet nuclear bomb to begin immediately. A young and talented Russian scientist, Igor Kurchatov, was appointed head of scientific research. Stalin personally ordered Lavrenti Beria to supervise the mission. Ironically, Stalin's victory at Stalingrad boosted the Manhattan Project as well. With good news from the Eastern Front and the Germans bogged down in Soviet territory, Roosevelt could devote greater resources to the secret program. In the United States, the best American and Western scientists were working to build the bomb. In Russia, nearly all of the scientific and economic resources were still fully engaged in the war against Germany. Only a few dozen physicists were involved in nuclear research, and they were in desperate need of laboratories, equipment, and funding. But they did have one advantage. Russian intelligence was operating at full strength, day and night. Moscow, the spring of 1943. Late one night, two senior NKVD officers hurried to the office of Pavel Fitin, the head of Russian intelligence. Leonid Kvasnikov was in charge of technical and scientific intelligence. Gaik Ovakimyan, former head of the Soviet spy station in New York, had recently returned from the States. They worked out a plan for a top-secret operation to get classified information on the development of the atomic bomb in the West.
The operation was codenamed Enormous. Its priorities were to identify the main bomb research centers in the States, get the names of the atomic researchers, and find out who among them were communist sympathizers.
In the darkest days of World War II, many Western scientists believed that the fate of the world depended on the situation on the Eastern Front. It made sense, they reasoned, to help the Russians.
There were several key espionage agents for the Soviets who focused on the atomic energy issues. In England, for example, there was Klaus Fuchs, German-born physicist, communist, a devoted, ideologically committed individual who went to work in the midst of in the very bowels of the atomic energy project in England and gave the Soviets probably more important information than any other agent.
Fuchs made the first move and contacted Soviet intelligence on his own when he came to the Soviet embassy in London and offered his services. He believed that socialism would bring Western people freedom, equality, and fraternity.
Klaus Fuchs, codenamed Charles, became the first key atomic spy for the Soviets. He was followed by others.
Another British agent whom we encountered in the course of our research into the KGB archives for our book, The Haunted Wood, was named Eric. We never found out, even in the Soviet files, they were very protective of his name. He was apparently a very effective researcher because he not only gave them British information, but he passed along the information that came from Washington or from Ottawa or from other sources of information based on the atomic project.
Like Klaus Fuchs, Yorick refused to take any money for his services. He was an idealist who believed in the communist cause. NKVD agent Vladimir Barkovsky was Yorick's London handler.
British counterintelligence never discovered his identity. He was a very brave man. During the worst raids on London, the bombs falling, the anti-aircraft guns blazing, I went to our appointed meeting place because I had to go. I am a Soviet intelligence officer. But why did he come? He could have been safe with everyone else, hiding in the underground shelters.
In August 1943, Churchill and Roosevelt met with Mackenzie King in Quebec, Canada, for secret discussions. Churchill agreed to put his British nuclear research under American control. The nuclear program was straining an already overstretched British war budget. In England, the program was also vulnerable to air attacks and German espionage. Churchill's crucial decision significantly boosted Allied nuclear efforts. By the end of 1943, leading British nuclear scientists were arriving in the United States. Agent Charles, Klaus Fuchs was among them. His Soviet handlers eagerly re-established contact with him. In the United States, Fuchs met his new handler, Harry Gold, who was an American of Russian descent. Their first meeting took place in February 1944, New York, at the corner of 59th Street and Lexington Avenue. A lean man with a green tennis ball in his right hand was approached by a short, stout man wearing leather gloves and carrying a green-covered book. The man with the ball was Klaus Fuchs. The other was Harry Gold. Gold said the code words, "Do you know the fastest way to Central Station?" Fuchs answered, "Your best bet would be to take a cab." Contact was established. Little did Fuchs know that he was one of the final links in an elaborate Soviet atomic spy ring in the U.S. The ring was controlled out of the Soviet consulate here in Manhattan, near Central Park. Three key handlers operated out of this building with the code names Twain, Alexei, and Kalistrat. Overseeing the operation was the new deputy resident of the Soviet station in New York, Leonid Kvasnikov. Moscow sent him here on a special mission.
Не только нагружены, но перегружены.
We were more than loaded with work. We were overwhelmed. We all had to find ways to meet our American friends several times a day. Very tricky. I, too, was handling several people. In my case, it was particularly difficult, sometimes impossible, to arrange meetings. I was constantly under surveillance. Sometimes I had to meet my contacts while shopping with my wife, or while at the movies.
Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin was becoming increasingly concerned about the slow pace of Russian nuclear research. After Beria reported on yet another American success, Stalin summoned his top scientists to the Kremlin. He wanted results, not excuses.
A leading Russian physicist, Akademian Yoffe, told Stalin, "The task is very difficult. Yes, we know now that we can solve the problem of the nuclear bomb, but we don't have a scientific base, and all our best scientists are engaged in solving current military challenges." Stalin cut him short. No doubt it would be easier without the war, but scientists should not be wimps. Nuclear deterrence is the only thing to save us.
Pressured by Stalin, Beria in turn pushed Kvasnikov to expand his American atomic spy ring.
Until very recently, we have been unaware that there was an even more important Soviet spy at Los Alamos. The youngest major spy in modern history. He was one of the most brilliant physicists that the United States has ever produced. His family had been born in Russia, but he himself had been born in the United States. He went up to Harvard University at the age of only 15. He graduated as a physics major at the age of only 18. He was immediately recruited to Los Alamos.
His name was Theodore Hall. For over 50 years, only a handful of people in the Russian Secret Service knew that in 1944, Hall had become the second key atomic spy in Los Alamos. He operated under the codename Mlad, an old Russian word for youth.
Hall was a driven, committed communist who believed the Soviet Union was the utopia that Stalin and his aides liked to paint it for their acolytes outside the Soviet Union. At one point in his life, along with a friend who was also a communist, wandered the streets of New York looking for a Soviet agent. Went into the Soviet consulate. Finally, one of the Soviet, was an intelligence operative, interviewed him, and he was able to make contact with the key Soviet operatives on this project, and he proceeded to pass to them amazing material that he brought from Los Alamos.
The Russian spy masters decided that it would be best to meet Klaus Fuchs and Theodore Hall somewhere near Los Alamos. Harry Gold usually met Fuchs in Albuquerque or Santa Fe. Hall's handler was Lona Cohen. She usually met Hall in Santa Fe. Lona Cohen and her husband Morris were the all-American spy couple. Morris Cohen had been recruited by Soviet intelligence back in 1937 in Spain. Later, he drew his wife Lona into his spying activities. In 1945, Lona went to Santa Fe for a special meeting with Theodore Hall.
When there was a very dramatic episode, according to the understanding with our people, she was to go to the university town to meet a young fellow. That is from whom she was to get the material. See? She went 3 weeks in a row. He didn't show up. However, she thought that she would go one more time. So she went the 4th time, and from his dress, the materials he carried, she understood that was the one she wanted. They met, and he gave her the material.
Unknown to Soviet intelligence, new top security measures on the Manhattan Project included potential searches of anybody leaving the vicinity of Los Alamos. At the train station, Lona Cohen had to act quickly to escape and secure the papers. In the station's toilet, she quickly put Hall's papers in the bottom of a box of tissue. Back at the train door, Lona asked one of the policemen to hold the tissues while she searched in her bag for her ticket. Then she pretended to sneeze, and the policeman returned the box to her. Lona boarded the train with the box and the hidden papers back in her hands. Lona returned safely to New York. Theodore Hall's report was saved, and the Soviet spy network narrowly missed being exposed. The Manhattan Project was the most extensive secret operation in American history. In the race to build the bomb, it was of the utmost importance to protect the nuclear breakthroughs from German spies. But by now, the Americans were suspecting another danger, this time from their communist ally, the Soviet Union. Ironically, it was a dedicated anti-communist Russian, Boris Pazh, who headed security at Los Alamos. Boris Pazh was the son of the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church in America, a church that was banned in the Soviet Union. Pazh knew better than most the cruel realities of the communist regime. He had a deep suspicion of scientists thought to be leftist sympathizers, like Robert Oppenheimer. Pazh tried to block Oppenheimer's appointment as scientific director at Los Alamos. General Groves, commander of the Manhattan Project, dismissed Pazh's concerns. Groves noted that security measures in Los Alamos were unprecedented in scope. Scientists working in different departments were prohibited from communicating with one another without Groves's special permission. All telephone conversations in Los Alamos were monitored, and all correspondence was thoroughly reviewed. Special passes were required to enter the facility and the surrounding area. The scientists and their families were periodically shadowed and photographed both inside and outside the facility. All those working in Los Alamos were allowed to leave town only once a month. Employees returning from vacation had to report all their contacts to a security agent. But even these draconian precautions could not keep the Soviets out.
Finally, another extremely valuable find emerged for the Soviets in the person of a young machinist named David Greenglass, who was also a communist. David Greenglass's brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg, essentially talked to David's wife, Ruth, who told them that David was working on this top-secret project.
Julius Rosenberg was a Soviet agent. Before he recruited Greenglass, however, he had no connection with the nuclear world.
They used Ruth Greenglass. She basically was also very much on the far left, agreed with them that it would be helpful if David cooperated, persuaded her husband to cooperate, and so Greenglass brought out designs of the atomic bomb's lens mold and other information. He was not a technically trained figure in the sciences, but he could provide what machinists can provide, namely the materials that he was working on, and it was extremely valuable.
The veteran Soviet agent Harry Gold, Klaus Fuchs's handler, added Greenglass to his list of agents. Gold's trips to Albuquerque to meet Fuchs now yielded a bonus, the files from Greenglass. The Russian spy masters were also security conscious. They kept their scientists isolated. Fuchs, Greenglass, and Hall didn't know of each other's spying activities. If one was caught, the others couldn't be exposed. The system worked well as the Soviet atomic spy ring expanded.
At the beginning of 1945, Soviet intelligence in Canada recruited several more scientists. However, the arrival of an experimental physicist, Alan May, was the greatest of all Russian successes in Canada. Alan May had worked on development of the bomb in Britain. There he had been recruited to the Soviet cause. In Canada, he was given a near impossible task: to obtain samples of uranium-235.
Uranium-235 was the radioactive material necessary to make the atom bomb. Every aspect of uranium mining, production, and storage was heavily guarded. One day, Alan May asked to see his handler. They met in Montreal. May held up a small glass tube. The Soviet agent asked what it was. May told him, "It's uranium-235. The agent knew that no matter what, he had to deliver the tube to Moscow. The fragile test tube was sewn into a special belt. A Russian courier, Colonel Motin, tied the belt around his bare waist and covered it with his shirt. Then he flew to the Soviet Union. In Moscow, a car was waiting for Colonel Motin on the airfield. In the car was none other than Lavrenti Beria. He took the tube and dismissed the courier. Till the day he died, Colonel Motin suffered from radioactive burns. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. Their race for the bomb was over. Allied scientists were relieved, but in the Far East, the war with Japan was grinding on, and tensions were rising between Stalin and his Western allies. Soon after the collapse of Germany, Soviet agent Lona Cohen went to Santa Fe for another meeting with Los Alamos physicist and Soviet spy Theodore Hall. The American scientists were completing preparations for the explosion of the first atomic bomb. This time, Hall gave her detailed information about the finished bomb. He also told her that the first ever detonation of an atom bomb would take place on July 16th in the desert at Alamogordo. He added ominously that if the tests were successful, atomic bombs might be dropped on Japan. After Leona Cohen returned to New York, the other Soviet handler, Harry Gold, went to Albuquerque to meet Los Alamos physicist Klaus Fuchs and technician David Greenglass. Gold forwarded their reports to Leonid Kvashnikov. Comparing the three reports convinced Kvashnikov of the accuracy of his information. Now it was only a matter of time before the atomic genie was let out of the bottle. On July 16, 1945, just as Theodore Hall had reported, the United States successfully tested the atomic bomb. For the three leaders who met at Potsdam, and for all mankind, the world was a different place. Stalin wondered if the United States would drop the bomb on Japan, and if they did, what the results would be. August 6, 1945, Squadron Leader Colonel Paul Tibbets flew a modified B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, over Japan. At 8:15 a.m., the bombardier released an atom bomb nicknamed Little Boy on Hiroshima. The 9,000-pound weapon destroyed the city, killed 78,000 people, and injured another 69,000. 3 days later, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped in Nagasaki with almost equally horrific results. 40,000 dead, 25,000 injured. Japan capitulated.
For the first time, Stalin understood the horror and power of this new weapon. He was convinced that given a sufficient quantity of nuclear bombs, the United States would use them to do away with the Soviet Union.
Extremely fearful of American intentions, Stalin pulled out all stops to catch up with the Americans and become a nuclear power. By 1945, Lavrenti Beria was under enormous pressure to produce an atomic bomb. His normal methods were the whip and the gulag. Already thousands of workers, in reality slave laborers, were dying from cold, hunger, and savage treatment. But Beria's brutal methods couldn't be applied to the complex problems of nuclear physics. So Beria built Artemis 16, 400 kilometers from Moscow. Artemis 16 was never marked on any map. It was a self-contained city hemmed in by barbed wire and patrolled by guards with machine guns 24 hours a day. Life inside the compound was a paradise compared to conditions elsewhere in the war-ravaged country. The atomic scientists and technicians had at their disposal such rarities as sausages, eggs, and butter. But Beria made it clear that failure would be dealt with severely. For the top scientists, the choice was stark: succeed or die. Beria made 2 lists with the names of leading scientists and engineers. One of them listed awards to each of them if they succeeded. The other provided harsh punishments, including execution, if they failed. But the scientists had one advantage: secret information from the successful American program. Beria was especially security conscious about this intelligence information. Only 2 Soviet scientists had access to it: Igor Kurchatov and his brother Boris.
Well, my head was always busy with the atomic bomb. Igor Kurchatov asked specific questions which I answered. He used to tell me how the work was going on, what problems they had, letting me know what additional information on these problems they needed. We passed on these requests to our stations overseas.
Following Beria's orders, Igor Kurchatov passed the American discoveries to his nuclear scientists working on different aspects of the project in Arzamas 16. But they were told that the information was the work of Kurchatov and an unknown group of Soviet scientists conducting research in a top-secret nuclear laboratory tucked away beyond the Ural Mountains. Kurchatov's own handwritten notes revealed the crucial importance of the intelligence from the West. He wrote, "My analysis of the documents proved their utmost unprecedented significance to our state and to our science." Stalin realized early on that the bomb was useless without the capability to deliver it. At that time, the Soviet Union didn't have a long-range bomber, and designing one would take years. To save time, Stalin's agents were ordered to steal the blueprints and technical specs for America's long-range bomber, the B-29. Mikhail Gorshkov, a Soviet agent then based in Italy, was assigned to the case.
Technical documentation for the B-29 became a priority. We started searching for it. It is not simple, you know. You can't just put an ad into a newspaper.
Gorshkov was able to recruit an Italian whose brother worked at one of the B-29 assembly lines in Brazil. The Italian was sent to Brazil with a large sum of money. 2 months later, Gorshkov received a telegram from Brazil. It read, "Coming home, meet me at the port."
Soon I saw my agent carrying a heavy case. I asked him, "What's in it? Bricks?" He said, "No, it is all that you asked me to bring."
A talented Russian designer, Andrei Tupolev, was put in charge of the bomber's construction. Tupolev argued for a variation in the design, but Stalin would not listen. He wanted an exact copy of the B-29. Tupolev responded with a bitter joke that could easily have cost him his life. He asked, "Should we paint American stars on the wings too?" Soon the Russian Tu-4, an exact replica of the B-29, was flying. Now Stalin had his delivery problem solved, but the bomb itself was not yet ready. While the Soviets were forging ahead with their research, they still needed key components to make their bomb. Earlier in the spring of 1946, Klaus Fuchs had returned to Britain from Los Alamos. He was given a senior position at the British Nuclear Center at Harwell. Intelligence agent Alexander Feklisov was sent to Britain as his handler.
I went to the meeting, always carefully checking to see if I was followed. First, I walked alone. Then my comrade picked me up in his car. We checked again. Then my comrade followed me and eventually gave me the signal that I was clean.
Their first meeting took place in a pub. They continued their talk in the street.
I asked Fuchs if he had brought any materials. He answered yes. "I've got what your comrades need." And he passed me the documents. I'll tell you straight out, Fuchs gave us detailed materials on the development of both the uranium and the plutonium bomb. Theoretical materials, its explosive mechanism, everything we needed.
The Soviet Union had the complete plans of the first atomic bomb. And so the first Soviet atomic bomb was an exact copy of the first American atomic bomb.
The first Soviet nuclear test was set for August 29, 1949.
2 or 3 days before the test, Lavrenti Beria came to inspect the testing grounds. He came into my automatic control center. I showed him the programming device in action. Multicolor lamps sparkling beautifully, and so on. He said, "I will watch from here." I was horrified. The situation was tense. Our first atomic explosion, I'm responsible for the launch. I had to be totally focused, and here, sitting behind my back, was the nation's #1 hangman.
When an excited Beria woke Stalin up at his dacha in the middle of the night to report that the test had been a success, Stalin answered sleepily that he already knew and hung up. The test of the Soviet atomic bomb was a triumph for both Soviet science and Soviet intelligence. But at the height of their success, the atomic spies were in even greater danger. Western experts knew the Russians would eventually build their own atomic bomb. Most felt that the Soviet Union, devastated by years of bloody war, would need at least a decade to do it. But early in September 1949, U.S. intelligence discovered traces of an atomic explosion. Air samples taken over the Pacific revealed radioactive residues. The Soviet detonation of an atomic device was a shock to the United States. By now, Western counterintelligence agencies knew the Soviets had operated espionage rings in the States.
The first major breakthrough in terms of their recognition that they were dealing with a very organized and very extensive spy ring came, of course, through the defection and the statements to the FBI of Elizabeth Bentley in 1945.
Elizabeth Bentley was one of the most important couriers in the Soviet network in the early 1940s. She revealed a great deal about their espionage techniques. Even more crucial evidence of Soviet espionage came in September 1945. A Russian military intelligence cipher clerk based in the Canadian capital of Ottawa defected with piles of incriminating documents. Igor Gushenko incriminated Alan May and 13 other Soviet spies who had operated in Canada. On March 4, 1946, May was arrested in England and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Then Klaus Fuchs, second in command of the British nuclear facility at Harwell, came under suspicion. His telephone number had been discovered in a notebook found on one of the Soviet spies arrested in Canada. But counterintelligence had no proof, and still no clue that the Canadian spies were just one link in a massive North American spy ring based in the States. That break came with Operation Venona. Venona was an American counterintelligence operation to decipher secret Soviet message traffic in the 1940s. Released by the National Security Agency in 1996, Venona confirmed long-suspected fears about Soviet spying, such as the involvement of Alger Hiss, a U.S. State Department official infamously linked to another Soviet sympathizer, Whittaker Chambers. In the last year of the war, American intelligence obtained 1,500 pages of the NKVD's secret codebooks. The codes were used for messages sent to Moscow by Soviet spies from all over the world. In 1948, a brilliant American cryptologist, Meredith Gardner, succeeded in breaking the Russian code. In the years that followed, over 2,000 Soviet telegrams were decrypted. In 1949, the code of one especially important telegram was broken. It contained hints about Klaus Fuchs.
The deputy director of the center at Harwell came to me and said, "Klaus, tell us what they say is wrong and we will all back you up." For me, it was a shock. I had betrayed them, my own colleagues. Morally, I was not ready for it.
In 1950, a renowned British detective, William Scarden, began a psychological game with Fuchs. Over a period of months, he engaged Fuchs in discussions about morality and virtues, chipping away at his defenses. Finally, Fuchs confessed to spying for the Soviets. In April 1951, he was arrested and sentenced to 14 years in prison. If he'd been tried in America, he would have been sent to the electric chair. Klaus Fuchs told his interrogators about the American who was his handler. The FBI already suspected Harry Gold and had questioned him several times. Gold steadfastly maintained his innocence. Then the FBI found a map of Santa Fe in his apartment. Shown pictures of Gold, Fuchs confirmed that indeed Gold was his handler. Gold was promptly arrested and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Harry Gold revealed the identity of another Soviet agent, David Greenglass. Operation Venona confirmed his name. In return for freedom for his wife and a plea bargain for himself, Greenglass implicated Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. In the most famous of the American spy trials, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were found guilty of treason, though, like Alger Hiss, they protested their innocence to the end. The Rosenbergs were executed in 1953. Even then, the full story of Soviet espionage was not known. In 1955, Khrushchev ordered the KGB to destroy part of its archives, including all the materials of Operation Enormos. But surprisingly, the KGB disobeyed. Intelligence officers hid the files of Enormos in a cell of this KGB prison, Lefortovo. For decades, the files were kept hidden here. These are the original files of Operation Enormos. Russian super spy Pavel Sutoplatov was one of Beria's top men within the Soviet intelligence network. In the mid-1990s, he made a startling claim. He announced that the head of the Manhattan Project, Robert Oppenheimer, and one of his leading scientists, Enrico Fermi, had supplied top-secret information to the Russians.
The spy apparatus in Moscow are looking for anything they can get their hands on that has to do with the American atomic bomb effort, including tidbits that real Soviet spies are picking up from unwitting physicists and other scientists in Los Alamos. So if they're sitting around having a cup of coffee and they say something, it's possible that one of the committed Soviet spies, such as Klaus Fuchs, will overhear something or even be told directly by his colleague Fermi or his colleague Oppenheimer. And he will put that into the report that eventually gets back to Moscow. And Moscow then puts Fermi and Oppenheimer down as people who've provided information. But they didn't provide information as spies. They provided information that a colleague has picked up.
Venona provided evidence that there were other Soviet spies associated with the nuclear project. However, some of them were never revealed.
The stakes were the future of the world, and for many of the young communists who accepted at face value the images of the Soviet Union put forward by Stalin's own propaganda people, to be a communist and a Democrat, small d, were not necessarily in conflict. But above all else, they were anti-fascist, they were romantic idealists, and there was this blind faith that led them down the road to profound betrayal.
While the Soviet atomic spies are still reviled as traitors in the West, they are revered in Russia.
Here in Russia, these people are considered heroes. They helped to establish the nuclear balance. And after all, it prevented a nuclear disaster.
One thing is clear, these men and women had a profound effect on modern history, and they showed that no secret is impenetrable.
One of the greatest Soviet intelligence successes, indeed one of the greatest intelligence successes of all time, was the penetration by Soviet intelligence of the top secret atomic laboratory at Los Alamos.
The world had entered the nuclear era. For years, superpower rivalry and mutual deterrence had maintained an uneasy nuclear peace. But the atomic genie could not be put back in the bottle. Over the years, many countries have joined the nuclear club: Britain, France, China, Israel, India, and Pakistan. In the new millennium, these countries, like the United States, will have to guard their own technology. As long as some nations have the bomb and others do not, the hunt for atomic secrets is destined to continue.